This session today is very much to talk about what's going on in the HAFF space. It's a really exciting time in the sector. We've got a pretty exciting time ahead of us with all the work that's being done federally around the Housing Australia Future Fund. But we do acknowledge that there will be some people in the room that are very aware of what's going on. Got a very dodgy set of glasses on, I do apologise. And we also acknowledge that it's a bit of a moving feast and there's varying degrees of knowledge. So if you don't know a lot about the HAFF, I'm really glad that you were able to come today because Nathan is the man to tell you. So we're really thankful to NHFIC for reaching out to Shelter WA and the community housing organisation sector to hold this get together and have a collaborative discussion and give an update on the HAFF. So I would like to invite Nathan to have a chat with you. Nathan's got a presentation that he will make and then we'll be open for Q&A at the end. So please relax and make yourselves at home. We're amongst friends. We would like this to be an open and honest discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks very much for having me, and also to the people online. It is a good reminder in terms of how big WA is, and I do appreciate the people joining us online as well. Let me also acknowledge the traditional owners of the country, the Whadjuk, and they're on Whadjuk country, and then recognise the continuing connection to land, waters and community and culture. And we also pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So let me take you through a bit of a sort of quick summary, I guess, in terms of where things are up to with the Housing Australia Future Fund. And in particular, what are the sort of key functions that we're looking at in terms of the government's key announcements. And please, if you think I'm going too slow, please accelerate me through the slides, and sort of happy to sort of zero in on those issues that you find the most topical. So just sort of quickly step through NHFIC. We're a Commonwealth corporate entity. We've been up and running now for almost 5 years. We have a piece of legislation. We have the investment mandate. And we've had a couple of functions that we've been managing for the last couple of years. So one of those, hopefully you'll know about, is the bond aggregator, which essentially is providing long-term cheap finance. And we've had 3.4 billion in terms of approvals to date by the board. And we've also had 2.2 billion in terms of bond issuances to date. And our bonds are rated social and sustainability bonds. So they're very much focused with an ESG agenda, and we've certainly sort of seen very strong demand from investors for this particular product as we build a new asset class focused on social and affordable housing. We estimate we've saved CHPs, community housing providers, over $600 million in that time frame. So it has made a substantial difference to those community housing providers that have availed themselves of the funds from the bond aggregator. We also have an infrastructure facility, which has been initially used to support critical infrastructure to unlock supply. More recently, the government expanded the remit of the infrastructure facility to also include the construction of social and affordable housing. And since that change was made, we've had quite strong demand for funds under that program, which is a combination of grants and concessional loans. We also run the home guarantee scheme. There's some changes made on the weekend that you may have seen, just in terms of some of the eligibility criteria, but that started off as a home guarantee scheme as an alternative to mortgage insurance. That has progressively expanded over the last couple of years, and now we have around 50,000 places focused on first home buyers, focused on single parents, and also on the regions. And then we have our research function. So that research function has been looking at supply, demand and affordability issues. Most recently, we had the State of the Nation report released last month, and we had a workshop in Sydney last week, which ran through the findings. Certainly one of the key findings, which I'm sure is no surprise to you, just relates to affordability pressures and how, particularly in the rental side, and how those pressures have been deteriorating in recent times, and obviously the need to do more in terms of supply, which obviously leads me to the Housing Australia Future Fund and the Housing Accord. So the HAFF is a $10 billion investment by the government into a fund. There would be an income stream which would then be utilised by NHFIC, which would become Housing Australia. And the basic objective is to use that income stream to support the delivery of 30,000 homes, 20,000 social, 10,000 affordable. And in addition, as part of the Accord agreement announced by the Treasurer and the Minister for Housing last year with the states and territories, local governments and other stakeholders, NHFIC Housing Australia will also have the task of delivering another 10,000 affordable. And all of this is meant to happen over 5 years, but as many of you know, the legislation is currently before the Senate. There was I've already mentioned some of these things, but just in terms of some of the recent announcements. So part of the announcement, for example, from National Cabinet last week, there was a range of announcements, but one of those announcements related to the liability cap that NHFIC has. It was previously $5.5 billion. The government has decided to increase that to $7.5 billion. So that would certainly help NHFIC in terms of expanding, particularly the bond aggregator side of things, as we support the delivery of the government's HAFF program, assuming it passes. So just quickly focusing on the different objectives associated with the HAFF. As I've mentioned, it's the 30,000 that's related to the HAFF, an additional 10,000 that is that relates to the Accord. There is that sort of 50% social, 50% affordable. Some of the things that we've been looking at in terms of, the definition of social and the definition of affordable, because that's can vary, I guess, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There's this idea that unlike NRAS, where you're seeing properties roll off in many respects after 10 years, and that is reverting from affordable to market, there is a desire to have the 40,000 properties stay social and affordable. So we sort of envisage that at least there being at least 25 years before properties, there could be the option in terms of recycling those funds into more social and affordable housing. And I guess the basic idea of building a new asset class over time still remains, but accelerating that and also trying to deepen our relationship with institutional capital. So we've been quite successful in terms of tapping through our bond issuance program into institutional markets. But when you look at the amount of capital that's required to deliver the 40,000, that takes, the sums of money that we've been looking at to the next level. So we're very much sort of focused on, from a financial structuring point of view, looking to attract private sector capital into the HAFF. So in terms of timeline, we're looking at, subject to the passage of legislation again, sort of 1 July this year in terms of kicking off the process from an EOI application process. There is a desire to have 8,000 commitments underway in 23-24. That's just simply 1/5 of 40,000. Certainly the feedback that we're getting to date is that there is a very strong pipeline. Some of the strong activity that we've seen in the construction sector is starting to lessen when you have a look at, say, out the next 12 months out to July next year. So we think the timing is good in terms of providing that support to the forward pipeline. Community housing providers, we certainly see community housing providers being for-purpose organisations as one of the key delivery partners for the Housing Australia Future Fund. States also qualify, but we sort of think that CHPs, given your focus on social and affordable housing, certainly provide an optimal delivery platform. As I mentioned, we're looking to deliver, we're trying to leverage private capital through a variety of sources. So for those who sort of work and finance their transactions, that's looking at banks, it's looking at institutional capital superannuation funds, It's looking at specialised impact investors. So it's sort of, we've been working through a consultation process, quite the range of investors that would typically look at housing. And as I say, trying to design a financing stack that would appeal to a whole range of stakeholders, but also optimise the risk return profile associated with that investment. I talked about the perpetuity and also just the fact that the 10 billion, the idea is it a perpetual fund. So we have to rely upon the income stream as opposed to tipping into the corpus is the basic idea. That income stream, as I mentioned, is up to 500 million. We sort of are out there talking to a range of stakeholders at the moment in terms of what else can be put on the table in terms of contributions, whether that be land, cash, density, uplift, expedited approval process. You know, one of the key, some of the feedback that we've had to date sort of relates to scale. So from an institutional investor perspective, with some of the super funds, for example, given the quantum of funds that they manage, they're basically looking at scale projects. So we've been thinking about ways, well, how do we get scale when you have a look at a, say, typical community housing provider project? It can be relatively small, like sub 100 properties. So we're sort of looking at ways that we can get scale to get that to satisfy that requirement from super funds. I think the bond aggregator is probably something that will sort of play a major role going forward. So people like Chris from Foundation have already accessed the bond aggregator. We sort of see that need for long-term cheap finance continuing. We are also looking to get banks involved in transactions. So in particular for the construction piece, where we think that, you know, subject to pricing and other requirements that banks have, we are looking to try and bring in private finance wherever we can. But at the end of the day, we have the $500 million to work with. And we have the 30,000, in the case of the HAFF, we have the 30,000 target. So it's trying to basically achieve these multiple objectives in terms of leveraging in private capital, but also trying to stay focused on the government's ultimate objective of the 30,000 over the 5 years. This is just a sort of basic run through in terms of, you know, what we anticipate the process would look like if the legislation passes. We are still working through what that process looks like. I guess we've had a lot of feedback in terms of procurement processes at both, you know, Commonwealth, state level. I think the basic objective that we have is like speed. So I think if we are looking to have 8,000 commitments over 23-24, then obviously we need to have an efficient procurement process. Obviously, we still need to satisfy all the necessary probity, value for money requirements. But we are looking to, as I say, sort of have a process that's relatively accessible, efficient and timely from a procurement process. So we're sort of aiming to have contractual close on the 8,000 properties by June 2024. Again, assuming that the legislation passes. Just sort of some of the indicative criteria that we've been sort of working up. And sort of part of the reason why I'm here today with Richard and Michael and also Kelvin is that we've been taking soundings in terms of multiple stakeholders. So talking to community housing providers, talking to private sector interests, developers, builders, talking to the states, talking to local governments, because all these parties are essentially critical stakeholders to deliver on the government's objectives. So this just gives you a sense of you know, what we see as the indicative criteria to sort of guide those conversations. Obviously, again, it's all subject to legislation and investment mandates and everything else. I mean, some of these are fairly generic, as you'd expect, in terms of value for money. But some of the key things, you know, for us, again, with that sort of primary objective of we've got $500 million a year maximum to work with. We've got 30,000 how do we then ensure that we deliver on that target? So price point is critical in terms of the property. We are looking at doing a housing needs analysis. So we want to have properties built where they're needed. It's also important to have properties built near supporting infrastructure and amenity. So people still feel engaged when it comes to broader community, but also their jobs, where they have jobs, but also other necessary support. So, you know, they have a property, but they also have the necessary support and amenity. I mentioned the price point, I mentioned location. I think also trying to get some sort of geographic sort of distribution. So across jurisdictions, but also within jurisdictions. I think, you know, for a jurisdiction like WA, obviously there's a very large community spread across a very large area. Looking at certain target groups as well in terms of victims of domestic violence, Indigenous community. So we're looking at a whole range of factors in terms of how we can prioritise projects, but there's certainly from a government point of view and also from a NHFIC point of view, there's an objective of trying to get that appropriate spread across different cohorts and also across different geographic areas. I think there's certainly an ambition to while we're looking at 8,000 commitments in terms of 23-24, we're also looking at you know, whether there's opportunities for keys indoors in 23-24, so actually to get people in as quickly as possible. I think all of you are sort of aware of, you know, rental affordability issues that playing out nationwide. So I think the objective of not only getting more supply in the medium term, but also trying to get some people in, particularly those that are most needy, into sort of properties if we can, is certainly another objective. And I think, you know, spot purchases where appropriate is certainly something that we'd consider. And I'm told that Perth is certainly an opportunity in terms of some of the spot purchases, but that may be something we can tease out through the Q&A. And as I sort of said before, you know, there's some other criteria here that the government have outlined, such as energy efficiency and so forth. But I guess this is all part of the process. We're looking for projects, but we're also engaged in a socialisation process so we can get the feedback from various stakeholders so we can make this work from all perspectives. Just to sort of touch on some of that, the things I've just said, you know, well-located land. We are looking at not just, you know, NHFIC, but also potentially other sources. So whether it's government, local government, faith-based groups, in terms of how we can make the financing work. I think the planning approvals, particularly for 23-24, are going to be critical. So I think certainly there's a pipeline there for 5 years. So where DAs, for example, are in prospect, we're certainly keen to hear about those deals, but I think the focus for 23-24 would be largely on those deals where we think, you know, DAs are in place or close to being in place and essentially can be activated fairly quickly, but also very interested in, you know, obviously the full 5-year pipeline, and so that way we can plan for it. I mentioned partnerships and cohorts. Next steps. So I think all of you know, in terms of what's playing out in terms of the Senate and the crossbenchers, we'll have a couple of days next week with the budget sitting period to see how negotiations progress. We're still working on the assumption that, you know, we'll be ready to go on 1st of July if the necessary pieces fall into place. I'm certainly optimistic and hopeful that we'll get to that point, but obviously those matters are outside of my control. We're continuing, as I say, to have that socialisation process and continue the preparatory work that we've been focusing on for the last several months, looking at the sort of pipeline, as I say, in terms of projects. The procurement and assessment process, I anticipate that we'll have a socialisation just around how that would work in June. So we'd be sort of having a team of NHFIC people coming out and sort of testing that with you. We sort of are talking to jurisdictions too about how we can align processes, because I think that's one of the other factors. I think, you know, from an efficiency point of view, to the extent that we can align, where we can with state and territory government practices, I'm certainly sort of open to how we can do that. I think the benchmarking is going to be critical. So when we get all these projects coming forward, how do we, if we are oversubscribed, how do we prioritise projects is another sort of important aspect. The needs analysis, as I say, that will guide. It won't be the only factor, but it'll guide in terms of where properties go. And the other key piece of work that we're focusing on at the moment is the funding model, because at the end of the day, this model is based on external finance being sought. So there's a whole range of ways that you can do that. In some cases, 100% grants, makes sense, particularly in the more remote scenarios. But particularly for the metro and also regional, we do see sort of an opportunity to use private capital to look to leverage. We are still working through the different models in terms of, what would appeal from a institutional capital perspective. As I said before, scale is really critical. The cost of capital is also critical. So that's calibrating that risk return profile. But all of these sort of critical parts to the solution, we're aiming to be ready in June to, subject again to the legislation, to have a socialisation process. So that way, if things do fall into place, we're ready to go on July. So look, I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity. There's a lot of information to absorb, so happy to take questions. And I just wanted to say, from our perspective, my approach to this is, there's a very simple but very ambitious agenda in terms of delivering the 40,000, and we need a range of stakeholders to come together for this to succeed. And my basic objective is to work with you to find that right solution and deliver on the government's objectives, and ultimately support the most needy in our community get into stable, secure accommodation. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Any questions for anyone? Thanks, Nathan. That was great. You mentioned about project prioritisations based on a sort of needs analysis, looking at geographical areas and cohorts. What is your advice for the CHOs on how else to be ready so that they've got the best chances for success? Thanks.
Look, there's a couple of things. So, it boils down, I guess, a little bit based on, and I have to switch from CHPs to CHOs in WA, so thank you for the reminder. So I think it depends on the CHO's circumstances to some extent. So for the metro regional, so to some extent it's relationships, existing relationships. So some CHOs have quite extensive relationships, with developers, with builders. So I think it's sort of looking at trying to source land and, appropriate land that may fit the indicative criteria that I'm referring to. I think that's really probably the most important thing at this point. And then I think from a financing point of view, if you do have projects, Michael Palassis, who is based in Perth, we've engaged Michael to do, some first pass feasibility analysis. So if a CHO has a particular project but is not sure, whether it was sort of fit the bill and whether it works financially, Michael is available to do a first pass feasibility analysis to explore those particular projects. I think also we're sort of, playing a bit of a facilitation role in terms of, for those CHOs that don't necessarily have some of those relationships, we're also happy to try and facilitate conversations, with the developers, builders that we're talking to, and CHOs if that relationship doesn't exist. I think too, just from a broader capability perspective, we do have the existing, capability fund within NHFIC that can also assist in terms of I guess, more generic capability issues, and always happy to talk to CHOs about, whether there's a particular need that we could assist with. I guess the key thing is really moving as soon as possible, notwithstanding, what's happening with the legislation, because I do want to, I'm very focused on delivering on the government's commitment, particularly for 23-24, to build confidence and trust in the program that, this can be delivered in a timely fashion. There's been experiences in other near countries where there've been sort of large targets made and they've fallen short. So I'm very focused on delivering on the outcome. So I would just encourage, if you are looking at projects, to reach out as soon as you can, and we're happy to provide the necessary assistance where we can.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Vast country, vast state, and heard things such as scale and speed and, the importance of media. Really interested if you could expand on how you think this process will actually help put more houses into regional and especially remote WA, where it's going to be potentially hard to attract private investment, those sorts of bits and pieces. So yeah. Thoughts around that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And look, I must confess my geography of WA is pretty limited. So please bear that in mind. But I guess for that, what I was envisaging, and based on the sort of conversations I have, is certainly, there's a regional area in WA, and then which was particularly that southwest part. So I think, that metro southwest is, and sort of out to Kalgoorlie, is certainly sort of areas where we think, leveraging in finance is a possibility. There's still a sort of need for some degree of aggregation, I think. Now, whether that's CHPs working together, which is one option that's, I guess, been floated, or a CHP aggregating up projects. Another option would be sort of, we look at ways to try and aggregate projects and then take a sort of a larger number, if you like, to institutional investors. So we're open to having conversations with community housing providers and sort of running some of these ideas past those community housing organisations that operate in the regions. I think for the remote side of things, that's probably more, to me, you're more in the 100% grant sort of space, because, getting private finance, when you look at the numbers, the degree of leverage you get is typically very low. And I think also it's important for us to work with other arms of government, whether that be local government, where they exist in the remote areas, state governments, and also the federal government. So we're having conversations with a range of parties in terms of, what is the tailored solution when it comes to delivering, housing in those more remote areas.
I was just wondering, given the remit's been expanded around the infrastructure facility and allowing what I would envisage some direct investment in social, is that a grant type application that could be applicable, be it regional or for those really business cases that don't stack up from a investment perspective, but are critical to support vulnerable people? And could you maybe expand what that new process might look like?
Thanks for the question. So the infrastructure facility initially, so it was a $1 billion program. So there was $175 million worth of grants, $825 million worth of concessional loans. Initially, it was focused on critical infrastructure, but the reality is the sort of pace of people accessing that program wasn't quick enough. So that led to the government making the changes in September last year, and that basically changes or broadens the eligible projects beyond just critical infrastructure to also include the construction of social and affordable. So if you look at those ratios, 175 and the 825, that's the sort of basic ratio that we apply when we sort of have a look at projects. So that 4 to 1, 4 being the loans and that 1 being the grant, so 20% roughly. So then what we do is we assess projects to see how we can use the grant component there's a lot of flexibility in the concessional loan aspect as well, in terms of capitalising interest. The rate is more competitive than the bond aggregator by and large. So we sort of look to sort of play around with both parts of the financing stack, and then also working with state and territory governments. So the indicative criteria that we've used to guide the NHFIC is also looking for that supporting contribution from the states and territories. So if we're doing social housing, for example, the 20% grant, even if you play around as much as you possibly can, you know, with the loan part, you're still not going to get there. So I think that's where the state coming in and sort of providing some form of additional assistance is how we get those deals to work. And because we've got 575 maximum to work with, so we're trying to stretch that 575 as far as we possibly can. There have been some small deals where we have provided 100% grant funding, but they're typically, you know, $1 million or $2 million or so. So yeah, they're the sort of basic criteria that we've applied, but all projects are in scope, you know, in terms of whether it's remote, regional, metro. It's really sort of that key, looking for that, you know, partnership with a CHO and also the state and territory, and then sort of just looking to sort of leverage, you know, the best possible supply outcome. I have to say the take up it's been very strong. So, you know, I'd anticipate that 575 is close to being exhausted as well.
I just had a quick question, Nathan, about housing need analysis, and if climate adaptivity is being considered as part of that. Recently in WA, we had the release of the Stuck in the Heat report, which highlighted that a number of current social housing homes will become unlivable, and that they will need a certain amount of climate adaptivity. Yeah,
look, the needs analysis. So we actually, our State of the Nation report this year actually had a special chapter on needs analysis. The primary focus there was on, you know, rental affordability as being one of the key metrics. There's other metrics. There's a whole range of different methodologies that can be applied. I think in terms of the you know, the climate dimension, energy use, whether it's cooling or whether it's, you know, heating, you know, like what you'd be doing in Tassie, for example, that's certainly a dimension that we'll build into when we do the value for money assessments, you know, in terms of accounting for those different factors. Because obviously, you know, the cost of building is largely similar, and I know, but there are variations that you get from region to region. So that's certainly something that we'll be, you know, factoring in. I think also the government has articulated, you know, energy efficiency standards as well that they want to have satisfied, and that they were announced as part of the Accord process. So we'd be looking at, I think as a general rule, we'd be deferring to each jurisdiction's requirements when it comes to energy efficiency. But, you know, we certainly recognise that there is that variation across jurisdictions.